The sharp sound of a slap against flesh echoed through the high ceilings of the dining room and instantly silenced the laughter of 50 wealthy guests. I am Olivia, 32 years old, and I had never felt such deep humiliation until that Christmas gala in the Hamptons. Everything started innocently enough as I was carefully navigating through the crowded living room with a silver tray of vintage red wine, when a tipsy guest suddenly stumbled heavily into my right arm. The dark crimson liquid splashed violently all over the pristine white silk dress my sister, Caitlin, was wearing to show off to our relatives. Before I could even regain my balance, her hand flew across my face with enough force to leave a burning red mark on my cheek. She glared at me with pure venom, screaming at the top of her lungs about her ruined $25,000 dress. My father didn't offer a shred of defense. He simply walked to the heavy oak front door and held it open into the freezing winter night. "Apologize to your sister," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "or get out. This house has no room for an ungrateful child." I stepped out, into the snow, in silence. Welcome to When Karma Strikes channel. I'm out for a walk today, getting some fresh air to help me process intense stories like Olivia's. Where are you tuning in from? Are you out being active too? Or just relaxing? Let's get back to it. Olivia was in the freezing Hamptons night, but her mind was moving with clinical precision. I didn't cry as the heavy oak door slammed shut behind me, echoing into the freezing Hamptons night. I didn't beg for them to let me back in from the biting wind, or explain for the thousandth time that I wasn't the one who had stumbled. Instead, I walked to my car, my boots crunching on the fresh snow, and sat in the deep silence of the leather interior. The mark on my face was still burning, a physical reminder of the poison I had allowed into my life for far too long. But my mind was already moving. With a cold, clinical precision, I rubbed my eyes, not to wipe away tears, but to summon the focus I needed. This wasn't a family crisis anymore. It was an accounting error, and it was time for a total reconciliation of the books. I pulled my laptop from the passenger seat. The screen glowed against the darkness of the driveway, reflecting a different kind of sunrise, one made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I wasn't an ungrateful daughter, as Jeffrey had claimed. I was a business partner whose capital had been misappropriated for half a decade. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, but now I realized it had been a subscription, with me footing the bill for every luxury they enjoyed. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and tonight, their credit had finally run out. My first move was the party itself. I navigated to my business account and found the pending transfer for the gala's catering and event management, $7,500. It was scheduled to leave my account automatically on Monday morning. With 2 clicks, I hit cancel. I could almost hear the frantic phone calls Laura and Jeffrey would receive in 48 hours when the vendors realized the payment had been clawed back. They liked the prestige of a Hamptons Christmas, but they had forgotten that prestige has a price tag, one I was no longer willing to pay. Then, I turned my attention to Caitlin. My sister loved her role as a social media icon, a lifestyle built entirely on the corporate credit card I had foolishly assigned to her as a fake brand consultant. I looked at her recent transactions on the live dashboard. $3,000 at a boutique in the city, $1,500 for a designer coat. She was living a life she hadn't earned, and I was the one paying the monthly bill. I selected her card number and clicked deactivate, unauthorized use. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her sense of entitlement was the only thing truly unauthorized in this house. Finally, there was the car. The white Tesla Model S, parked in the second bay of the garage, was mine. I had bought it, I paid the insurance, and I held the legal title. Caitlin treated it like her own property, but on paper, it was a company asset. I opened the vehicle management app on my phone. The GPS showed it sitting exactly where it shouldn't be in a house, where I had just been slapped and discarded. I activated the remote lockout and triggered the repossession protocol. In exactly 60 seconds, the car would become a high-tech paperweight. Caitlin would wake up tomorrow to find her keys useless and her digital life frozen. I closed the laptop with a definitive thud. The clock on my dashboard read 12:03 a.m. The conflict had reached its breaking point at 11:51 p.m. In 12 minutes, I had dismantled the infrastructure of their comfortable lies. I didn't feel sadness, and I didn't feel the panic they expected me to have. I felt the immense relief of a toxic contract finally being terminated. I put the car in gear and drove toward my penthouse in the city, leaving the glowing lights of the Hamptons estate in my rearview mirror. They weren't shocked by what they'd done to me tonight. They were about to be shocked that I'd finally stopped playing along. The highway stretched out before me, a dark ribbon cutting through the snow-covered fields of Long Island. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't want music to drown out the clinical clarity of my thoughts. I kept wondering, what did I ever do wrong? I remembered being 12 years old, watching my mother brush Caitlin's hair while telling me that my sister was the art and I was just the frame. I believed her then. I thought my job was to be the sturdy, invisible thing that held the beautiful people in place. But I've come to realize that the frame is the only thing keeping the art from falling to the floor and shattering. 5 years ago, my father sat across from me at my kitchen table, his face gray, and his eyes filled with a terror he couldn't hide. His manufacturing business had collapsed into a heap of $350,000 in unpaid taxes and commercial debt. He wasn't asking for a daughter's comfort. He was begging for a professional rescue. He was facing an investigation, maybe even time in a federal cell. I was the one who stepped up. I didn't just hand him a check. I was an executive. Even then, I purchased the Hamptons estate from him, clearing the massive tax liens and overdue mortgages to the state and securing the deed in my name alone. I became the sole owner of the only thing he had left. I gave them a place to live for free, thinking that my generosity would finally buy the one thing money isn't supposed to, their love. But looking back, I realize I had fallen into the trap of normalized cruelty. This is a psychological cage that many useful children find themselves in. When you provide for people for too long, they stop seeing your help as a gift and start seeing it as their right. My family didn't love me. They loved the function I served. My usefulness became my prison. They began to treat me like an appliance, something you only notice when it stops working, and something you kick when it doesn't give you what you want. They were living in my house as guests, on my dime, while I remained the ghost architect of their comfort. While Caitlin was busy posting photos of the family villa to her millions of followers, she never realized that every square inch of that marble floor belonged to the sister she just humiliated. My mother, Laura, would brag to her friends about their legacy, never mentioning that the legacy was being propped up by my late nights and 90-hour work weeks. My presence was a constant, silent reminder of their failure. So they decided to make me small, to make themselves feel big. They hated me because they needed me. I pulled into the parking garage of my penthouse, the silence of the concrete structure matching the coldness in my chest. I wasn't an ungrateful daughter. I was a landlord who had just been assaulted by her tenants. This wasn't a family breakdown. It was a balance sheet that had finally been settled. I had spent 32 years trying to fit into their frame, but tonight I realized I was the one who owned the gallery, and it was time to start taking down the art. My phone began to vibrate on the marble counter, a relentless buzzing sound that felt like a swarm of insects trying to invade my sanctuary. I didn't pick it up. I knew exactly what was on the other side of that screen. Finally, curiosity, or perhaps a lingering shred of the person I used to be, forced me to look. There were 34 missed calls and a string of text messages from my mother that read like a masterclass in emotional warfare. "Olivia, I am in shock," the first one began. "I cannot believe you would be so cruel to your own family just because of a small disagreement at dinner. Your father is humiliated, and your sister is in tears. You have always been so jealous of her happiness. Stop this nonsense. Unfreeze the accounts and come back to apologize, or don't bother calling me your mother ever again." I stared at the words, feeling a cold, hollow space where my heart used to be. It was the same script they had used for decades. The predator's mask was firmly in place. They were the victims, and I was the aggressor, for simply refusing to be a doormat. But the escalation didn't stop with a private text. I opened TikTok and saw that Caitlin had already gone live. She was sitting in the dimly lit foyer of the Hamptons estate, her mascara strategically smudged, sobbing for a digital audience of thousands. "I'm so scared, guys," she whispered into the camera. "My sister she lost it. She ruined my dress, and now she's trying to kick us out of our home in the middle of winter. She's always been so obsessed with control because she's lonely and bitter about my success. Please pray for my family." The comments were a bloodbath of strangers calling me a monster, a rich brat, and a soul-crushing villain. I watched it with a strange detachment. I realized in that moment that I had been bound by an invisible chain for 32 years. I call it the invisible chain of the survivor. It's a psychological cage made of what-ifs and maybe next times. I had stayed because I was waiting for a version of them that didn't exist. I thought that if I sacrificed enough, if I was useful enough, I could buy the love I never received as a child. But I finally understood a lethal truth. Sacrifice doesn't bring love. It only nourishes greed. You cannot fill a bottomless pit with your own blood and expect it to bloom into a garden. I had been their cash cow because I was afraid of being alone. But as I sat in the silence of my penthouse, I realized I had been alone the entire time. The only difference now was that I was no longer paying for the privilege of being hated. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I didn't respond to their messages. I didn't enter their digital circus. Instead, I sent one single email to my attorney, Heather. I attached the screenshots of Caitlin's live stream and my mother's threats. "Heather," I wrote, "they've decided to go public with their lies. It's time to show them the atomic bomb I've been holding." I went to my window and looked out at the city. Inside, my laptop glowed with a cold digital clarity. The ledger of their lies was finally open, and the math was undeniable. The silence in Heather's office was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a vintage clock that sounded like a countdown. Heather didn't offer me tea or a sympathetic pat on the hand. She was the most expensive litigator in New York because she traded in facts, not feelings. She slid a thick, black leather binder across the mahogany desk, a forensic blizzard of bank statements, internal audits, and canceled checks. My sister, Caitlin, had spent years parading around as my executive assistant, a title I'd given her to satisfy my mother's pleas for family unity. But the audit revealed that while I was building a logistics empire, Caitlin was building a criminal enterprise. I had seen the red flags in the quarterly audits months ago, but I had manually overridden the alerts, choosing to believe my mother's excuses over my own balance sheets. My mistake wasn't a lack of intelligence, it was an excess of loyalty. She had systematically siphoned $120,000 through a web of fabricated vendor invoices. I saw payments for luxury branding consultations that were actually transfers to offshore gambling accounts and high-stakes creditors. My sister wasn't just a social media narcissist. She was a thief who had used my company as her personal piggy bank to fund a lifestyle of reckless addiction. Every time she had hugged me and called me the smart one, she was mentally calculating the next withdrawal from my accounts. They are currently residents of the Hamptons estate under a zero-rent license agreement, Heather said, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. Because they are non-paying occupants without a formal lease, they have no tenant protections. You are the sole owner on the deed. Legally, they are nothing more than guests who have overstayed their welcome. I didn't feel the sting of the slap anymore. I only felt the weight of the legal hammer I was about to drop. My compassion had been a long-term investment that had yielded zero returns, and it was time for a forced liquidation. "Serve the papers," I commanded, my tone devoid of any daughterly affection. Heather nodded and produced the official document, a notice to quit. It was a formal termination of their residency, served in the early hours of this morning. Under New York law, since they had violated the implied code of conduct by assaulting the owner, 30 days was the absolute maximum I was required to give them before the police would arrive to physically remove them. The countdown began the moment the process server crunched his tires on the gravel driveway of the estate I had paid $350,000 to save. They were sleeping in silk sheets I had bought, breathing air heated by the geothermal system I maintained, and dreaming of a legacy they had never built. They didn't realize that the power was shifting from the favorite daughter to the legal executioner. By the time they finished their morning coffee, their 30-day clock to total ruin would already be ticking. I thought the audit was the final blow, but it was just the prologue to a much darker story. Heather sat across from me, her face a mask of professional neutrality, but her eyes held the kind of stillness that usually precedes a lethal strike. She didn't say a word as she handed me a single, high-resolution photograph of a document from a private lending firm in the city. My breath caught in my throat. It was a collateral agreement for a loan of $120,000, the exact amount Caitlin owed to her high-stakes creditors. I looked at the description of the asset used to secure the debt, my grandmother's diamond necklace. It was an auction-level piece, a museum-grade web of platinum and brilliant cut stones that was supposed to be my only inheritance. The one thing my grandmother had specifically set aside for me because she knew I was the only one who actually valued her legacy over her bank account. It was supposed to be in the family safe, a symbolic anchor of the only person who had ever truly loved me. Now, it was sitting in a dark vault at a predatory lending house, a victim of Caitlin's greed. I went to the estate with a court-ordered inventory specialist this morning, Heather said, her voice cutting through the ringing in my ears like a cold blade. The safe was empty. Your sister took it weeks ago. I didn't cry. They had treated my mercy like a credit card with no limit, never realizing that the bill would eventually come due, and I was here to complete the collection. This was the liquidation of my past, to fund their hollow future. Look at the signature on the second page, Olivia, Heather prompted. I traced the looping, elegant script at the bottom of the authorization form. It wasn't my handwriting, even though my name was printed clearly underneath the line. It was my mother's signature. Laura hadn't just turned a blind eye to Caitlin's crime. She had actively facilitated it. She had forged my name to sell the only memory I had left of my grandmother. The realization hit me with the weight of a lead curtain. They hadn't just stolen money, they had committed a felony. This was grand larceny and forgery in the second degree. They weren't just an ungrateful family anymore. They were a criminal syndicate operating out of my own living room. I rubbed my temples, feeling a surge of clinical clarity. This wasn't a family drama. This was evidence. They think they're playing a game of emotions, I said, my voice low and lethal. But I'm playing a game of law. I looked at the photograph of the forged signature again. My mother had signed her own arrest warrant the moment she put pen to paper. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family for 32 years, but the contract was finally terminated. Include this in the final filing, I told Heather. No more warnings, no more negotiations. I want the criminal division of the district attorney's office involved before the 30-day notice even expires. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray, unforgiving Atlantic. The kill shot wasn't the eviction. It was the truth. Inside me, the anger was no longer a fire. It was an iceberg, cold, heavy, and capable of sinking their entire world. Without a sound, day 30 arrived, with a biting wind that seemed to blow straight through the marble walls of the estate, and I pulled my SUV up the driveway at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Behind me sat 2 patrol cars from the Suffolk County Sheriff's Office and a white van belonging to a private moving crew. I had simply notified the utility companies that I would no longer be responsible for the accounts in my name. Since they didn't have a cent or a credit score to their names, the house had fallen into darkness and cold within 48 hours. The front door opened slowly. My father, Jeffrey, stood there in a heavy wool coat that looked 3 sizes too large for his shrinking frame. My mother, Laura, was huddled behind him, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with red. There was no gala laughter today. There were no 5-star catering trays or vintage wine bottles. There was only the silence of people who had finally realized their credit had run out. "Olivia, please," my mother whispered as I stepped out of the car. Her voice lacked its usual sharp, manipulative edge. "We have nothing. The bank accounts are frozen. Caitlin is. She's in a hotel room in the city, and they're threatening to call the police on her for the unpaid bill. We have nowhere to go." I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, cold and clinical. I looked at the house I had saved with $350,000 of my own hard-earned money. I looked at the parents who had forged my signature to steal my inheritance. "You signed my name to sell my grandmother's legacy," I said, my voice as flat as a balance sheet. "Now, you're going to sign your name to this." I reached into my leather folder and produced the final eviction order. "Sign it, and the moving crew will take your bags to the shelter. Refuse, and the officers will execute the formal eviction warrant right now while the district attorney processes the felony forgery charges I submitted earlier this week." Laura's hands shook so violently she could barely grip the pen. As she scribbled her signature on the line, the power dynamic that had defined my life for 32 years officially collapsed. They weren't shocked by what they'd done to me. They were just broken that I had finally stopped footing the bill. I didn't feel the triumph I expected. I only felt a profound sense of closure. In the weeks that followed, the Hamptons estate was sold for a significant profit. Caitlin was officially prosecuted for grand larceny and identity theft. My parents were settled in a small, subsidized apartment, living on the meager Social Security Jeffrey had left. I didn't look back. I used the proceeds from the sale to establish the Seat of Justice Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal and financial advocacy for women trapped in cycles of economic abuse by their own families. I've come to realize that some people will only value you for the function you serve, not for the person you are. If you are the useful child, the one who always says yes, remember that your compassion is a finite resource. You cannot set yourself on fire just to keep people warm who wouldn't even offer you a blanket in a storm. Forgiveness isn't always about making peace with the other person. Sometimes it is about making peace with the fact that you deserve better. It is about picking up the scissors and cutting the cord that tethers you to a past that was designed to keep you small. If you find yourself in a similar situation, know that it is not selfish to walk away. It is an act of survival. True loyalty must be earned through respect and reciprocal care, and DNA is never a license for abuse. I've found my peace, not in the revenge I took, but in the life I've built since. I am no longer the frame. I am the artist of my own future. Happiness is the sweetest revenge. Subscribe now if you believe in justice, and don't forget to share your own story to empower others.